He broke into a closed diner at 2 in the morning, soaked to the bone, stealing nothing but warmth. When the flashlight hit his face, he raised his hands and waited for handcuffs. Instead, the officer looked at him for a long moment, sighed, and said, "Get in the car, you'll freeze out here." He thought he was being taken to a cell. He was wrong. What began as one small act of mercy would unravel a secret neither man knew they shared: a dead brother, a stolen love, and a guilt that had followed them both for years. This is a story about two broken men, one storm and the home neither of them thought they'd ever find. A story about second chances, forgiveness, and the kind of love that doesn't ask to be understood, only to be believed. The rain came down sideways that night, the kind of December storm that made the whole coastline of Belhaven feel like it was being erased. Officer Elias Marsh drove his patrol car along Harbor Street with the wipers losing their fight against the wind, his radio murmuring low, his coffee long since gone cold in the cup holder. He had taken the night shift on purpose, the way he always did around this time of year, because the empty hours gave him less room to think about his brother. It was the flicker of a flashlight beam through the window of Dot's diner that caught his eye, a shuttered place that had closed for renovations weeks ago. He parked, stepped out into the rain, and moved toward the back door, which hung open on a broken latch. Inside, crouched by the cold grill with a stolen dish towel wrapped around his shoulders, was a man who looked like he hadn't slept indoors in days. The man's eyes found the flashlight, and instead of running, he simply raised his hands, slow and practiced, the gesture of someone who had done this before. "I wasn't taking anything," he said, voice hoarse. "I swear, I just needed to get warm." Elias lowered the light so it wouldn't blind him. Up close, the man was younger than he'd first thought, maybe close to Elias' own 34 years, with dark curls plastered to his forehead and a bruise-colored exhaustion under his eyes. There was a violin case, battered and duct-taped at one corner, resting against the counter like it was the only thing in the world worth protecting. "What's your name?" Elias asked. "Theo," the man said, "Theo Callahan." Elias should have called it in. Trespassing was trespassing, and the diner's owner, old Mrs. Petrakis, would have wanted to press charges on principle alone. But something in the way Theo held himself, spine straight even while kneeling, like pride was the only thing he had left, made Elias close his citation book without opening it. "Get in the car," Elias said instead. "You'll freeze out here." Theo blinked at him, confused then wary. "You're not arresting me." "Not tonight." Elias held the door open against the wind. "But you're not staying in an abandoned diner either." He drove Theo not to the station, but to his own house at the edge of town, a narrow two-story place with a porch light that always stayed on, a habit Elias had never been able to break since his brother Caleb died. He gave Theo dry clothes, made grilled cheese at midnight because it was the only thing his kitchen reliably produced well, and set up the couch with blankets that still smelled like fabric softener from a life Elias lived alone. Theo didn't ask why a police officer would do this. He seemed too tired to question kindness, as if he'd forgotten it was something that still existed. Over the following days, a fragile routine took shape. Theo stayed, at first because Elias insisted the storm wasn't over, and then because neither of them brought up him leaving. Elias learned that Theo had once been a violinist with real promise, accepted into a conservatory, until his father found letters that shouldn't have existed and put him out on the street with nothing but the case in his hands. Since then, Theo had drifted from town to town, playing on corners for spare change, sleeping where he could, running from a version of himself he'd been taught to be ashamed of. Elias in turn said little about himself, which was its own kind of confession. He was the town's steady, dependable officer, the one who helped stranded drivers and walked kids across the street after school, and the one nobody in Belhaven had ever seen with anyone, not a girlfriend, not a boyfriend, not so much as a rumor. He carried his own silence like a uniform he never took off. It was Theo who noticed first on a quiet evening when they sat on the back porch watching the storm finally clear. "You never talk about your family," Theo said gently, not pushing, just noticing. Elias' jaw tightened. "I had a brother, Caleb. He died 4 years ago." "I'm sorry." "He was 17. Elias' voice went flat in the way voices do when grief has been rehearsed too many times. "He was gay and our parents didn't take it well, and I was already gone by then, training at the academy, telling myself I'd deal with it later. I didn't call him enough. I didn't tell him it would get better. Then one night it didn't get better and there wasn't a later anymore." Theo went very still, and something crossed his face that Elias in the dim porch light mistook for simple sympathy. It would be weeks before Elias understood it was something closer to recognition. The town noticed Theo before either of them wanted it to. A neighbor mentioned seeing a strange man on Elias' porch. The diner's owner asked with a raised eyebrow whether the officer was running a charity out of his house. Belhaven was small enough that whispers moved faster than weather reports, and Elias' captain, a blunt man named Halvorsen, eventually called him into his office to ask, not unkindly but firmly, what exactly was going on. "He's a friend," Elias said, and hated how thin the word sounded. "Folks are asking questions, Marsh, about you, about him. You know how this town gets." Elias walked out of that office with his hands in fists, furious not at Halvorsen but at the years he'd spent building a life so careful, so unremarkable, that a single act of decency could threaten to unravel it. That same week, the twist arrived that neither man saw coming. Theo, cleaning out his violin case for the first time since he'd arrived, pulled loose a folded photograph tucked behind the velvet lining, a photograph of himself, 3 years younger, laughing beside a boy with the same sharp cheekbones and quiet eyes as Elias. Elias froze in the doorway when he saw it. "Where did you get that picture of my brother?" Theo's hands trembled. "Caleb," he whispered. "I didn't know his last name was Marsh. He never told me. He said his family didn't know and he was scared and I was scared too, and we were just two kids who found each other for a little while before." His voice broke. "Before he stopped answering my calls, I never knew what happened to him. I looked for him for months. I thought he'd just moved on from me." The air in the house went thin. Elias felt something crack open in his chest, grief and anger and a strange, aching relief tangled together so tightly he couldn't separate them. "You knew him, you loved him, and you never said anything." "I didn't know how," Theo said, tears finally falling. "I've been running from my own family for so long, and then I found you and you were kind to me, and I was terrified that if I told you the truth you'd see me as a ghost instead of a person." For 3 days, Elias barely spoke to him. He needed to be angry at someone, and Theo was there, carrying a piece of Caleb that Elias hadn't been allowed to keep. But grief has a way of circling back to truth if given enough silence, and in the stillness of those 3 days, Elias understood something he'd been avoiding for 4 years. Caleb had not died because he was unloved. He had been loved, fully and gently, by a boy with a violin case in the last months of his life, when Elias himself had been too far away and too afraid to say the words that mattered. He found Theo packing the violin case on the fourth morning, ready to leave before he could be asked to. "Don't go," Elias said. Theo turned, startled. "I thought you couldn't look at me." "I couldn't look at what you knew," Elias said. "Not at you. There's a difference, and it took me 3 days of being an idiot to understand it." He crossed the room and for the first time reached for Theo's hand instead of a badge, a citation book, or a locked door. "You gave my brother something I never had the courage to give him. You told him he was worth loving exactly as he was. I don't want to lose the person who did that, not because of him, because of you." The final storm came not from weather but from Belhaven itself. Word had spread, helped along by a jealous, small-minded deputy named Cobb who resented Elias' quiet authority, that Officer Marsh was involved with the drifter he'd taken in, and that the department's most respected officer might be exactly the kind of man this town had always quietly whispered about. Halvorsen called an internal meeting not to fire Elias but to clear the air, a phrase that meant Elias was expected to deny everything and send Theo away for good. Elias stood in front of the department he had served for 9 years, in the same building where he'd once accepted a medal for pulling a family from a flooded car, and he thought of Caleb, 17 and terrified and alone, needing just one person to say the truth out loud so he wouldn't feel like a mistake. "I'm not going to clear the air by lying," Elias said. "Theo Callahan is not a problem this department needs to manage. He's the man I love, and if that costs me this uniform, then it costs me this uniform. But I already lost one person I loved because I was too much of a coward to say so in time. I'm not doing that again." The room went silent. Halvorsen, to his credit, said nothing for a long moment, then simply nodded once, the closest thing to respect the old captain knew how to offer, and told Elias to get back to work. Not every whisper in Belhaven quieted overnight, but enough did. Mrs. Petrakis, of all people, ended up hearing Theo to play violin on Friday evenings at the newly reopened diner, and the sound of him drew in customers who had never once cared for classical music but came anyway, just to listen to something that sounded like hope. On a clear spring evening, almost a year after that first storm, Elias and Theo stood together on the same back porch where the truth had first cracked open between them, the porch light glowing warm against the dusk. Elias had planted a small tree in the yard that week, a young maple in memory of Caleb, its roots finally settling into ground that felt, for the first time in years, like home instead of hiding. "I thought you were taking me to jail that night," Theo said quietly, leaning into Elias' shoulder. "I know," Elias murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "I'm glad I didn't." Somewhere beyond the yard, the tide moved steadily against the shore, patient and unhurried. The way healing always is, not a single dramatic rescue, but 1,000 small choices to stay, to tell the truth, and to let someone in out of the rain. Spring in Belhaven had settled into something Elias Marsh had stopped expecting for himself, a life that felt unremarkable in the best way. Mornings started with Theo's coffee, always too strong, and evenings ended with the sound of violin strings drifting up through the floorboards from the little practice corner they'd built in what used to be a spare room. The maple tree planted for Caleb had taken root well enough to lose its stake, standing on its own the way young things eventually do. It was a Tuesday when the gray sedan appeared, moving slowly past the house twice before finally parking across the street. Elias noticed it first, the old instinct of a patrolman clocking anything unfamiliar on a quiet block. Theo noticed second and went still in a way that made Elias' chest tighten. "You know that car?" Elias asked. Theo's throat worked before he answered, "I know that man." The door opened and an older man stepped out, silver-haired, moving with the careful stiffness of someone whose body had started failing faster than his pride would admit. He stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, as if crossing the street required more courage than he currently owned, and then he came anyway. "Theo," the man said, voice rough, "it's your father." Theo's hand found Elias without either of them deciding it should. "I know who you are," he said quietly. "I just didn't think you'd ever come looking." Robert Callahan's eyes moved between his son and the man beside him, and something flickered there, not the old fury Theo had braced for, but something closer to exhaustion. "I'm not here to start anything," he said. "I'm here because I don't have the time left to keep being wrong." The words landed heavier than shouting ever could have. Elias felt Theo's grip tighten. They sat on the porch, the three of them, while Robert explained in halting sentences that a scan 6 weeks earlier had found something in his lungs that the doctors were calling serious in the careful, clinical way doctors use when they mean dangerous. He had spent 3 sleepless nights afterward doing the math on regret, he said, and every column added up to the same name. "I threw away 8 years without you," Robert said, looking at his hands instead of his son. "I told myself it was principle, it was fear. I was afraid of what people would think of me for raising a son like you, and I never once stopped to think about what it cost you to be raised by a man like me." Theo's eyes were wet, but his voice, when it came, was steadier than Elias expected. "I spent years thinking I deserved it, that there was something in me that needed fixing before anyone could love me right. It took almost freezing to death in an abandoned diner and a cop who wouldn't arrest me to learn that wasn't true." Robert's gaze moved to Elias then, taking him in fully for the first time, the uniform hanging by the door, the steadiness in how he sat close enough to Theo to matter. "You're the one who took him in." "I am," Elias said. "Then I owe you a debt I can't repay." Robert's composure finally broke just slightly at the corners. "I don't expect forgiveness today. I don't think I've earned the right to ask for it. I only wanted him to know while there was still time that I was wrong and that I love him and that I should have said both of those things a decade ago." The conversation did not resolve itself in a single afternoon, the way television confessions often do. Theo needed 3 days of silence afterward, walking the shoreline alone with his violin case before he could decide what forgiveness would even look like for a wound that old. Elias didn't push him toward it or away from it. He had learned from his own grief over Caleb that healing forced on a timetable rarely holds. It was during those 3 days that the second visitor arrived, not a stranger this time but Elias' own parents, whom he had not spoken to since the funeral 4 years earlier. His mother Diane called first, her voice small on the phone in a way Elias had never heard from her. She had heard through the same small-town channels that carried everything eventually, about the meeting at the police department, about the man Elias loved, about the maple tree in the yard. "We should have said his name at the funeral," Diane said, meaning Caleb, before Elias could even ask why she was calling. "We didn't, because saying it meant admitting what we'd done. I don't know how to undo 4 years of silence, Elias, but I don't want to lose you too by staying quiet." Elias stood in his kitchen holding the phone long after his mother stopped speaking, feeling a decision settle in his chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the tired, aching wish to stop carrying 2 griefs at once, Caleb's death and his parents' absence. He invited them to Belhaven on a Saturday in early June. The dinner was tense at first, 4 people around a table who had all failed each other in different ways and were only now learning the vocabulary to say so. Theo, who had returned from his 3 days of walking with something settled in his eyes, sat beside Elias and said little, understanding better than anyone at that table what it cost to sit across from the people who had once made you feel unworthy of love. It was Diane, unexpectedly, who broke the silence over dessert. "Caleb used to talk about a boy," she said, looking at Theo carefully. "Near the end, he never gave a name. He said there was someone who made him feel like himself for the first time in his life. I didn't understand what he meant back then. I think I do now." Theo's composure cracked gently, tears falling without apology. "That was me," he said. "I loved him. I've spent years wondering if it mattered, if anything I gave him was enough to outweigh everything else." "It mattered," Diane said, reaching across the table for his hand, the gesture of a woman finally willing to hold what she'd once refused to acknowledge. "It mattered more than you know." The reconciliation that followed was not instant or complete, old wounds rarely close in a single dinner. But it was real, built slowly over the following months through phone calls that no longer felt like obligations, a visit from Robert Callahan that lasted a full week instead of an afternoon, and Diane's eventual arrival at one of Theo's Friday evening performances at the diner, where she sat in the front row and cried through the entire second song without once looking away. By late summer, Elias had started leaving the porch light on for a different reason than grief. Habit turned into welcome, a signal that the house was open to anyone brave enough to walk toward it. On a warm evening in August, with the tide moving steady against the shore and Theo's violin resting silent in its case for once, Elias knelt on the same porch where Theo's father had once stood asking for forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved, and asked Theo a different question entirely. "I used to think home was just a place you went to be safe," Elias said, voice unsteady in a way it had never been on duty. "You taught me it's actually a person. I don't want to go anywhere else ever again." Theo said yes before Elias even finished the question, laughing through tears the way people do when joy arrives faster than words can keep up with. They were married the following spring in the yard beside the maple tree, now tall enough to throw real shade across the grass. Robert Callahan stood beside his son, thinner than the year before but steady on his feet, and Diane Marsh sat in the front row beside her husband, both of them finally learning, late but not too late, how to say a name they had once been too afraid to speak. Somewhere in the vows, Elias thanked a storm 4 years dead, and a diner nobody used anymore for bringing him a man who had loved his brother first and loved him second, and taught them both that forgiveness, like healing, rarely arrives all at once. It comes the way tide always does, patient, returning, until eventually it simply belongs to the shore. 2 years had turned Belhaven's small house at the edge of town into something neither Elias nor Theo had dared imagine on that first storm-soaked night. The porch light had become known around town as a kind of quiet signal, though few could have said exactly why. Theo taught violin to a small handful of students on weekday afternoons, his Friday evenings at the diner now drawing tourists as much as locals. Elias had been promoted the previous winter to sergeant, a decision Halvorsen had made, he admitted privately, specifically because Elias had shown the department what real courage looked like when it counted. They had also, quietly and without much ceremony, started something neither of them called a mission out loud. A small fund, seeded by Robert Callahan's insistence, and Diane Marsh's careful fundraising among her book club and church friends, had grown into a modest local network, a handful of trained volunteers, a hotline number printed on cards left at the high school counselor's office, a promise that any teenager in Belhaven afraid to go home for who they loved would have somewhere safe to go instead. They called it simply Caleb's Porch. It was raining the night the knock came, the kind of steady October rain that Elias had learned over the years to associate less with grief and more with the particular hush that settles over a house right before something important happens. The boy on the porch could not have been older than 16, soaked through a thin jacket, a backpack clutched to his chest like it held the last of everything he owned. His name, he said in a voice that shook more from fear than cold, was Milo. "I saw the card," Milo said. "At school, I didn't think anyone would actually answer." Elias felt something in his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with recognition. He had seen that exact posture before, the raised hands, the readiness to be turned away, the practiced bracing against rejection in a diner 5 years ago, in a man who was now standing just behind him in the doorway, reaching for a towel before either of them had said a word. Milo's story unraveled slowly over hot chocolate at the kitchen table, in pieces offered only as trust allowed. His parents had found messages between him and another boy from the neighboring town. There had been shouting, and then there had been silence, and then his father had told him with a calm that was somehow worse than anger that he wasn't welcome under that roof unless he was willing to stop this. "I don't know how to stop being who I am," Milo said, staring into his mug. "I don't think I should have to." "You shouldn't," Theo said, quiet and certain. "You don't." That night set a careful process in motion that neither man treated lightly. Elias, sergeant now and mindful of exactly what his badge required of him, made the calls he was legally bound to make: Child Protective Services, notification of Milo's parents that their son was safe, a temporary placement approved through proper channels rather than simply keeping the boy hidden in their guest room out of feeling alone. He had learned, in his years on the force and in his years loving Theo, that good intentions without the right process could cost a person everything, and he wasn't going to let bureaucracy be the reason this story ended differently than it should. But the proper channels moved slower than a frightened 16-year-old's nights, and it was Theo, more than anyone, who sat with Milo through the following 2 weeks of foster paperwork and family mediation sessions, teaching him 3 chords on an old guitar just to give his hands something steady to do, listening without flinching to every fear Milo had never been allowed to say out loud before. Word spread through Belhaven, as it always did, faster than any official notice. Most of the town had softened in the 2 years since Elias' confession at the department, but not everyone. Deputy Cobb, still nursing an old resentment that had never fully found its footing, filed a complaint suggesting Sergeant Marsh had overstepped his authority by involving himself personally in a minor's case rather than keeping appropriate distance. It was a technicality dressed up as procedure, and everyone who read it understood exactly what it was actually about. Halvorsen called Elias into his office for the second time in 2 years, but this meeting bore little resemblance to the first. "I've read the complaint," Halvorsen said, sliding the paper across the desk without ceremony. "And I've read your log of every call you made, every notification you filed, every box you checked. You didn't overstep anything, Marsh. You did the job better than most people manage when it's easy, and you did it when it was hard." He tore the complaint in half. "Cobb can find something better to do with his time." The parents' mediation, when it finally happened, did not end the way Milo's father had originally intended. Confronted gently but firmly by a state counselor, by Milo's own halting but honest words, and unexpectedly by Robert Callahan, who drove 3 hours to sit quietly in the back of the room as a father who had once made the same mistake and lived long enough to regret it, Milo's father did not change his mind in a single afternoon, but he agreed to family counseling. He agreed, at minimum, to let his son come home to a house where the subject was not forbidden, even if acceptance would take longer to arrive than anyone wanted. Milo chose, in the end, to stay most weeknights with a foster family 2 streets over, arranged properly legally, with visits scheduled rather than snuck through back doors, but he kept coming to Caleb's porch every Friday evening, guitar in hand now instead of just borrowed, sitting beside Theo's violin at the diner, until Mrs. Petrakis started reserving the corner table for what she'd taken to calling, with unmistakable fondness, the boys' bench. On the 1-year anniversary of that stormy October knock, Belhaven held a small gathering in the yard beside the maple tree, now grown wide enough to shade half the lawn. Milo, 17 now and steadier in ways that showed in how he carried his shoulders, played a song he'd written himself, clumsy in places but entirely his own. Diane Marsh cried through it exactly the way she had cried through Theo's performance 3 years earlier. Robert Callahan, thinner but present, sat beside his son with a hand on his shoulder that no longer needed explaining. Elias stood at the edge of the yard with Theo's hand in his, watching a boy who might have disappeared into the same silence that took Caleb, instead standing under string lights, playing music to people who had chosen, deliberately and completely, to stay. "We didn't get to save him," Theo said quietly, meaning Caleb the way they both still did sometimes, without needing to say the name. "No," Elias agreed, "but we got to save someone else because of him. I think that's the only kind of forgiveness grief actually offers, not an undoing, just a chance to make sure it happens differently next time." The rain that had once felt 5 years ago like the edge of the world ending had become, by then, just weather, ordinary, expected, occasionally beautiful, no longer a thing either man feared. What mattered was the porch light, steady against the dark, and everyone who had learned, one storm at a time, that it would always, always stay on for them. 4 years had passed since the night Elias Marsh found a stranger sheltering from a storm in an abandoned diner, and the town of Belhaven had, in its own slow and imperfect way, changed around them. Caleb's porch had grown from a handwritten hotline card into a modest building 2 blocks from the harbor, staffed now by 3 trained counselors and funded partly through the diner's Friday night tip jar, which Mrs. Petrakis had taken to calling, without apparent irony, the interest payments on kindness. Milo, 19 now, had gone off to a state music program 2 hours inland, coming home most weekends to play at the diner still, his chords no longer clumsy but sure, his shoulders carrying none of the fear they once had. Robert Callahan's illness had stabilized under careful treatment, granting him, as he put it, "borrowed time I intend to spend annoying my son as often as I can manage." Diane Marsh had become, somewhat to everyone's surprise, the shelter's most reliable weekend volunteer, the woman who once couldn't say her younger son's name, now the one who answered the phone at 2 in the morning when a frightened teenager needed somewhere to go. It was in this steadier version of Belhaven that Councilman Gerald Whitfield announced his run for mayor, built almost entirely on a single promise: rezoning the Harbor District, a promise that sounded on paper like ordinary municipal business, until the fine print made clear that Caleb's porch sat squarely inside the parcel he intended to sell to developers. "It's not personal," Whitfield told the local paper in the careful language of a man who wanted it understood as exactly that without saying so. "It's about responsible use of town resources. There are questions about whether a private shelter with this particular focus should be occupying prime harbor real estate at all." Elias read the article twice at the kitchen table before setting it down, jaw tight in the way Theo had learned over 4 years meant an old fear resurfacing rather than a new one arriving. "They can't just take it," Theo said. "They can," Elias said quietly. "If enough people vote for a man who wants it gone, they absolutely can." Weeks that followed unfolded like a slower, more civic version of the storm that had first brought them together, less dramatic, but no less threatening to everything they'd built. Whitfield's campaign leaned harder into coded language at town hall meetings, careful never to say the word gay directly, speaking instead of certain lifestyles and values Belhaven has always held. While his supporters grew bolder in comment sections and diner conversations, Mrs. Petrakis pointedly refused to serve. Deputy Cobb predictably resurfaced as one of Whitfield's most vocal supporters, framing his years-old grudge against Elias as principled concern rather than what it had always actually been. Elias found himself for the first time in years seriously considering silence as a strategy, staying quiet, letting the shelter's supporters fight the political battle without making himself the visible center of it, protecting the family he and Theo had built from a spotlight that history had taught him could turn dangerous. It was Theo, gently, who talked him out of it. "You stood in front of your whole department once and told the truth because you said you'd already lost one person to silence," Theo said, sitting across from him on the porch where so much of their life together had already been decided. "This isn't different just because it's bigger." The town hall meeting 3 weeks before the election was, by Belhaven standards, unusually crowded, folding chairs pulled from the church basement to accommodate the overflow. Whitfield spoke first, careful and polished, painting the rezoning as fiscal responsibility, the shelter's closure as an unfortunate but necessary casualty of practical governance. When it was Elias' turn, he did not bring notes. He stood in his sergeant's uniform, not because he needed the authority it lent him, but because he had decided, driving to the meeting, that he was done separating the two halves of his life that Belhaven had once insisted stay apart. "4 years ago, I found a man freezing in an empty diner and decided not to arrest him," Elias said, voice carrying easily in the crowded room. "That decision cost me nearly everything I thought I needed to protect: my career, my reputation, the careful invisibility I'd built my whole adult life around. It gave me back something I didn't know I'd lost, which was the chance to actually live instead of just surviving quietly." He paused, letting the room settle. "My brother Caleb died 4 years before that, 17 years old, because this town and our family taught him that who he loved made him something to be managed rather than someone to be protected. Caleb's porch exists so that doesn't happen to anyone else's child. If Councilman Whitfield wants to rezone that harbor lot, I'd ask him to look every parent in this room in the eye and tell them exactly which children he's willing to lose to make room for condominiums." The silence that followed was the kind that Elias had learned, over the years, could go either way, the held breath before either rejection or recognition. It was Robert Callahan, of all people, who stood next, leaning on a cane he'd needed since the previous winter. "I threw my own son out of my house for exactly the reason this shelter exists," he said, voice steady despite his visibly failing strength. "I have maybe a handful of years left, and I intend to spend every one of them making sure fewer families make the mistake I made. I'd ask this town to vote for whichever future does the same." The election, when it came, was not a landslide, but it was decisive enough. Whitfield lost by a margin narrow enough to prove the town remained divided, but wide enough to prove unmistakably which way it was leaning. Caleb's porch stayed exactly where it was, the harbor lot rezoning shelved indefinitely by a new council eager to distance itself from the controversy that had cost their predecessor the seat. In the quieter months that followed, Elias and Theo made a decision they had circled gently around for over a year without quite committing to out loud. They applied together to become certified foster parents, not to replace what Caleb's porch already offered, but to open their own home the way it had once been opened for Theo, permanently rather than temporarily, to a child who needed exactly that. The first placement? A quiet 8-year-old named Wesley with careful eyes and a habit of flinching at raised voices, arrived on an ordinary Tuesday rather than during a storm, carried in through the front door instead of found shivering behind one. Theo taught him his first 3 chords within the week. Elias left the porch light on that night out of nothing more complicated than habit, the same habit that had once guided a frightened, soaked stranger safely toward warmth, now simply guiding a child toward the quiet certainty of a home that intended to keep him. You know, Theo said that evening, watching Wesley fall asleep on the couch mid-story, violin case still open on the floor beside him, I used to think home was the place I ran from, then I thought it was the place you took me instead of jail. He looked at Elias and then at the small sleeping shape across the room. I think now it's just wherever we decide to keep the door open. Elias reached for his husband's hand the way he had every night for 4 years and did not correct him, because for the first time in either of their lives, there was nothing left to say that the porch light hadn't already made clear.